The courtroom was silent as the lawyer stood up, a wild gleam in his eyes, ready to launch into his argument. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone in the room knew something big was about to unfold, but what happened next wasn't just shocking, it was a moment that would go down in history. The lawyer, known for his theatrics, had made a name for himself with his bold, often controversial tactics. He was the kind of lawyer who didn't play by the rules. His approach to the law was unorthodox, to say the least, and he thrived on disrupting the order of the courtroom. But today, it seemed he had underestimated the man sitting at the bench. Judge Boyd was no stranger to drama in the courtroom. He had seen his fair share of flamboyant lawyers, all trying to make a name for themselves by pushing boundaries and testing the limits of courtroom decorum. But what was about to happen was something entirely different. This was no ordinary case. The lawyer had decided to go all in. He was determined to make an impression, to be remembered, but what he didn't realize was that he was playing a dangerous game with the wrong opponent. The lawyer, standing confidently, began speaking louder and faster, as if to assert his dominance in the room. "Your Honor, I've come prepared. My client's case is the most important thing in this courtroom today. No one else matters," he declared, his voice booming. The other lawyers exchanged looks of discomfort, but no one dared speak out. It was a common tactic, a show of bravado designed to unsettle everyone in the room. But it wasn't working. Judge Boyd remained unmoved, his face as calm as ever, his eyes sharp and calculating. The lawyer continued, undeterred. "This is a case that will change everything. My client's innocence is beyond question. We have the evidence. We have the witnesses. All we need is the truth to be heard," he said, his words growing more passionate, almost desperate. He threw a file across the table, the papers spilling out in a disorganized mess. "This is what the world needs to see," he added, a flourish in his tone. But instead of the expected applause or support, the room was silent. Judge Boyd's gaze never wavered. Without missing a beat, he leaned forward slightly, his voice as steady as the stone foundation beneath the courtroom floor. "Counselor, this is not a circus," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "You will present your case with the professionalism expected of you. If you continue with these theatrics, I will have no choice but to remove you from this courtroom." The lawyer froze. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even an order. It was a statement of fact. Judge Boyd had delivered a message loud and clear. This was not the place for showmanship. The lawyer's confidence faltered, but he quickly recovered, standing tall once again. "Your Honor, he began, but the judge cut him off. "No," Judge Boyd said, his tone firm. "You will not interrupt the court. You will not waste anyone's time. You will proceed with respect, or I will have you removed. The choice is yours." There was a collective gasp from the room. The lawyer, who had built his career on bending the rules and pushing boundaries, was being put in his place. For the first time in his career, he felt powerless. The realization hit him like a brick wall. Judge Boyd was not like the others. He wasn't afraid of him. He wasn't intimidated by his antics. He was uncheckable. The opposing counsel, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke up. "Your Honor, we ask that the lawyer be allowed to continue, but that he conduct himself in accordance with the decorum of this courtroom," they said, their voice calm and composed. The words were a subtle yet powerful acknowledgement of the judge's authority, and they carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what was at stake. Judge Boyd nodded once, his expression unchanging. "Very well," he said, "but I will not tolerate any further disruption." The courtroom fell silent again, the tension palpable. The lawyer, now visibly rattled, looked down at his notes, trying to collect himself. He was no longer the center of attention. The courtroom had shifted. The focus had returned to the law, and he was no longer the one in control. For a few moments, there was a lull. The lawyer attempted to regain his composure, gathering his papers and trying to make sense of the mess he had created. But it was clear that the damage had been done. Judge Boyd had commanded respect, and the lawyer had lost his. The room could feel it. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second as the lawyer attempted to present his case. His words lacked the confidence they once had. He stumbled over his points, his arguments falling flat. The audience could see it. He was no longer the master of the courtroom. Judge Boyd had reduced him to just another attorney, and nothing he could do would change that. The power dynamics had shifted entirely. The opposing counsel, sensing an opportunity, began to present their side with newfound confidence. They were calm, collected, and professional. Everything. The lawyer was no longer. Their argument flowed smoothly, their evidence presented without the theatrics that had marked the lawyer's presentation. It was a stark contrast, and the difference could not have been more apparent. As the lawyer grew more desperate, his attempts to regain control became more erratic. He raised his voice, waved his arms, and tried to divert attention back to himself. But it was no use. Judge Boyd had taken command of the courtroom, and the lawyer's antics were nothing more than noise now. The judge's stern gaze remained unwavering, his silence more powerful than any words he could have spoken. "You will not speak out of turn," Judge Boyd said, his voice cutting through the lawyer's desperate attempts to salvage the situation. "You will conduct yourself as a professional, or I will have no choice but to remove you from this courtroom." It was a warning, but there was no doubt in anyone's mind that Judge Boyd meant every word. The lawyer sat down, defeated. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed, and for the first time he was silent. The courtroom, which had been on edge moments before, now felt oddly peaceful. The power had shifted entirely, and the respect for the law had been restored. As the proceedings continued, the lawyer remained quiet, his attempts to regain control forgotten. He had been put in his place, and there was nothing he could do about it. The judge had set the tone, and the courtroom had followed his lead. As the trial progressed, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from chaos to a calm, professional rhythm. The once dominant lawyer, who had entered the room ready to command attention with his brashness and bravado, now sat in silence. His previous antics had failed to disrupt the proceedings. Judge Boyd had not only maintained control of the room, but had reasserted the gravity of the courtroom's decorum and professionalism. For those watching, it was a clear lesson in the power of authority and respect. Despite the lawyer's earlier theatrics, the case had to continue. With Judge Boyd's order still fresh in the air, the opposing counsel moved forward with their argument. They had been silently observing the scene, knowing that their turn was coming. Now that the lawyer's distracting performance had been quelled, they proceeded without hesitation. The opposing counsel, composed and calm, presented their evidence with clarity. Every document, every witness statement was carefully laid out, free from the noise that had earlier characterized the courtroom. The arguments were logical and concise, reflecting a deep understanding of the law and the case at hand. There were no interruptions, no attempts to derail the discussion. The courtroom was silent, save for the sound of papers being shuffled and the soft voices of the attorneys. Judge Boyd, while maintaining his usual calm demeanor, kept a sharp eye on the proceedings. He asked questions when necessary, his voice calm but authoritative, ensuring the process moved forward with precision. He knew the importance of maintaining momentum after such a disruption. The lawyer had made his point, but it was clear now that only the facts would carry weight. As the day wore on, it became evident that the lawyer's previous outbursts had not only cost him the respect of the courtroom, but had also undermined his case. The opposing counsel's argument was built on logic, backed by solid evidence, and articulated with the precision expected in a courtroom. They were not distracted by the lawyer's showmanship. They were focused on the task at hand. The audience, too, seemed to have shifted their focus. Where there had once been whispers and side glances as the lawyer tried to play to the crowd, now there was nothing but rapt attention. The audience, which included a number of legal professionals and law students, recognized that they were witnessing a moment of legal history. They weren't just seeing a trial, they were seeing the power of professionalism and the consequences of failing to respect the law. Judge Boyd's handling of the situation had set the tone for the entire case. It wasn't just about the lawyer or the opposing counsel. It was about the principles that governed the courtroom. Justice was not something to be bargained with. It wasn't a game. It was a serious process, one that demanded respect and decorum. And Judge Boyd had made it clear that anyone who wished to undermine that process would be held accountable. By the time the trial reached its final stages, the lawyer was a shadow of his former self. His earlier bravado had evaporated, leaving only the remnants of a man who had tried to manipulate the system. He had failed, not because of the quality of his arguments, but because he had chosen to fight with theatrics instead of facts. The judge, with his calm demeanor and unyielding authority, had ensured that the courtroom was a place for the law, not for egos or performances. As the closing arguments were made, the lawyer had nothing left to say. His earlier attempts to derail the trial had left him exposed. The courtroom had witnessed his desperation, and Judge Boyd had made sure it wouldn't be tolerated. When it was his turn to present his final remarks, the lawyer merely nodded, his voice barely audible as he delivered a subdued, straightforward conclusion to his case. Gone were the dramatic gestures, the grandiose claims. In their place was a quiet acceptance of his defeat. The opposing counsel, in stark contrast, wrapped up their argument with confidence. Their case had been clear from the beginning, and they had not let themselves be distracted by the lawyer's antics. They presented their final points methodically, with no rush, no embellishments. They simply laid out the facts, and in doing so, they had won the respect of the courtroom. Judge Boyd, with the precision of a seasoned jurist, addressed the court one final time. "The case is closed," he declared. "The facts have been presented. The law will do the rest." As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the proceedings, it was clear that this trial would be remembered for more than just the case at hand. It would be remembered as a turning point, a moment when the integrity of the law was defended and upheld. The lawyer had tried to disrupt the process, but Judge Boyd had stood firm. The lesson was simple: the law would not be swayed by bravado. It would stand strong no matter who was trying to bend it. For the lawyer, it was a moment of reflection. He had tried to make the courtroom his stage, but in the end, it was the law that had performed the final act. The opposing counsel left the courtroom with a sense of quiet satisfaction that they had not only won the case, they had seen the true power of a courtroom run with dignity and respect. And for everyone who had witnessed the trial, there was no doubt that Judge Boyd's handling of the situation had set a new standard for how the law should be respected, both inside and outside the courtroom. The message was clear: no matter who you are or how big your reputation, in the presence of justice, everyone is equal. If you were amazed by how Judge Boyd handled this extraordinary courtroom moment, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories. Stay tuned for more gripping legal battles and unforgettable moments.